I'm Terrence Krehbiel, and I teach expository writing here at the Well-Trained Mind Academy. I came to the Academy in 2019 after retiring from a 35-year career in public high school English classrooms, teaching everything from composition to creative writing to British and American and world literatures. I sometimes tell people I spent 3.5 decades in the 11th grade before finally graduating. And I do love 11th and 12th graders. But I am so excited right now to be teaching the very early teens and sometimes preteens, depending on their age when they begin taking our expository writing courses. I just love their enthusiasm, their cooperative approach to the lessons, and I love watching their growing confidence as we go. I get to participate in their first introduction to the research skills they will need for the rest of their academic writing lives, learning to cull information from other sources, and beginning to learn the methods of documentation. Our expository writing program takes the model of classical Greek rhetoric as its approach to writing instruction. This means that each of the various forms of expository writing is presented in terms of its unique requirements. The Greeks called this form or shape or purpose of a composition its topos, or the plural term topoi. That sounds fancy, but it's pretty simple. In writing, we're sometimes comparing two things. Sometimes we're defining a term or idea. Sometimes we're describing a thing or place or person. And each of these purposes for writing has its own requirements and takes its own shape. So, starting simply and progressing slowly, we develop each of these topoi, which build on one another progressively until we're eventually combining a variety of topoi seamlessly into a single composition. This is a wonderful approach to writing that keeps intention and purpose and overall shape foremost in the writer's mind. This approach develops in the writer the habit of asking, what am I trying to make, and what are the elements required to make that thing? That is, how do I compare two things? How do I define a term or write a sequence of steps? It's a much more organic approach than I have run into in other programs. Students in my classes can rely on several predictable elements from week to week. They attend two 55-minute class sessions a week, either Monday, Wednesday, or Tuesday, Thursday. Following the classes, they're given a weekly homework assignment due the following Monday or Tuesday night. This is generally a composition, rarely longer than 400 words, demonstrating the kind of writing covered in that week's lesson. Each assignment is accompanied by a rubric, that is, an explicit guide to the expectations of the assignment. Students are encouraged to keep this rubric close as they complete the assignment. This is also the guide I refer to as I respond to the students' submissions, so they can know how well they are producing the assigned writing tasks. Preparatory work is published to students from week to week so that they know what must be done prior to each class meeting. Typically, this involves textbook reading and exercises. We can get a sense of what a typical class session might entail by looking at a brief sample lesson. The following lesson is a continuation of our discussion from the previous week concerning the method for describing a person. Welcome to this demonstration of a little piece of a lesson that you might find in one of my expository writing classes. Typically, I would begin class coming on the camera like this and greeting students, taking the roll, any housekeeping chores that have to be done before going into the lesson slides themselves. So I'll turn now to the lesson slides and begin speaking as if I'm speaking to the students. Okay, gang, welcome back to this week's lessons. Remember last week we began talking about how to describe a person, and we learned at that time that there are a number of aspects you can use besides just their physical description in order to describe a person. We'll review some of that a little bit later in this lesson. We also talked about how you might affect what your reader feels about the person, positively or negatively, by the way you use language, so that you can slant your description to the positive or the negative. This week, we want to talk about how to employ a metaphor, an extended metaphor, throughout the passage in order to organize the description sort of around a central idea or theme. Okay, so you've got this passage from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol on 237 of your text. Let's take a look at this together, and just want to mark it up just a little bit here first before I begin. And then we'll talk about how Dickens is using figures of speech. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. Secret, self-contained, solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and on his eyebrows, and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days, and did not thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. So I'd like us to notice, a couple of things here. First of all, he's using this figure of speech of being squeezing and tight-fisted to mean covetous or greedy. He also talks about how he's hard as flint, and also how he is secret as an oyster, self-contained, unknowable. So Dickens begins with these similes, hard and sharp as flint, secret, self-contained. But the rest of the description is a metaphor that settles on the cold within Scrooge. Let's take another look here. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheeks, stiffened his gait, made his lips blue, spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime means frost. A low temperature, he iced his office and did not thaw his office. And so we have this one metaphor of coldness that is carried on throughout the whole rest of the passage. We sometimes call this an extended metaphor, or we might say that he uses that one metaphor to cover over the whole passage. And that makes me think of another word we use, overarching, an overarching metaphor that literally arches over the whole passage. Okay? When we say someone is cold, we don't really mean physically cold. We mean they're cold-hearted, they're unresponsive. We mean they have a cold personality, but even a person with a cold personality has a normal body temperature. So we're saying that a person is what they really aren't. A metaphor is a way of saying something is what it really isn't. We have similes. He's sharp as flint. That's a good figure of speech that helps us to see. He's hard as steel. That description between his personality and steel is very clear. But a metaphor is goes a little bit deeper because it simply says that something is what it isn't. We say that her eyes were pools of luminous light. That's beautiful. Except her eyes aren't pools and they aren't light. They are eyes. They are literally eyes, and only figuratively. That's what we mean by a figure of speech. They're only figuratively pools. But it's much more direct. Instead of saying her eyes were like pools, we say her eyes were pools of luminous light. Well, no, they weren't. So her eyes were blue. That's true. But this metaphor is in some ways truer because it gets at an emotional truth. And that's the value of using metaphor. To say that her eyes were bottomless pools is a way of, no, they weren't literally, but there's a kind of an emotional truth that communicates in the same way that some of the language about Scrooge communicates a real emotional truth about what kind of a person he is. So even when we say a person is cold, we don't mean physically cold. They have a normal temperature, and so does Scrooge. But when Dickens writes his description, he uses physical cold as this governing or extended overarching metaphor. And he doesn't say Scrooge was as cold as an iceberg. He says he might say Scrooge was an iceberg. That's not part of the passage. But instead, he describes Scrooge's physical appearance and actions in terms of physical cold. So let's just look at what he does say about Scrooge's physical appearance. The cold within him froze his features, nipped his nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, eyes red, lips blue. So at this point, I would invite students to come up with words that we use to mean physically cold. And here they can respond in class and give me suggestions for words: chilly, icy, etc. We'd develop this list, and then we'd talk about words that we might use to suggest a person's personality. They were frosty, or they were have a wintry disposition, etc. We use words like that a lot. And then I would press forward to this completed list that I have prepared, and we'd discuss the words that they included and the ones that they didn't include, like they probably wouldn't come up with bleak. And we would discuss how the words in the emotional or the metaphorical side sometimes literally refer to temperature, but other times they only suggest temperature, like joyless or stony, etc. And so we just have a conversation about these words and continue to discuss how Dickens did use these terms. And then we talk about, for a moment, what would happen, imagine what would happen if Dickens didn't use that metaphor, if he just said his nose was pointed and his cheeks were shriveled and he walked stiffly and his eyes were bloodshot, etc. I mean, we'd still be able to picture Scrooge, but we wouldn't have as deep an impression of him. We wouldn't know anything about what Scrooge is like. So, of course, Dickens could have just added Scrooge was cold and distant, but now we have a separate physical description and emotional description. And good writers, and Dickens is a great writer, always trying to do more than one thing at a time. So instead of writing a physical description followed by a character description, Dickens makes his writing more effective, more powerful, more memorable, and emotionally, to the reader, emotionally truer by using this metaphor to do both at the same time. That's the point of the lesson. And that's an example of the way that we proceed in class to illuminate the textbook and prepare the student for the writing sample, the writing lesson for that week. Thanks for joining me.